Just
Yes.
only see Judith. So Judith, you got to nod for me if you can see everything.
Yes, that looks great.
Wonderful. And when I'm screen sharing, I can't see the chat and the Q&A. So Judith is going to help me, but folks, you guys should feel free to put questions in along the way. Judith, feel free to interrupt along the way. If I use acronyms or say things that spark questions, don't feel like you have to wait until the end. We'll be as informal and together as we can while all in our own rooms and kitchen tables and wherever it is that we all are. So good morning, everybody. I'm sorry to not be able to see all your beautiful faces, but I'm so glad to be able to be with you. I'm going to talk this morning, and thank you to Ohio AEYC and all the higher ed folks for bringing me in today, and to everybody who I know is out there, people who are on the committee and folks I know in Ohio. Hello to all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the power of the profession and the unifying framework for the early childhood education profession. I'm going to walk through, some of you will know this really well. For some of you, this may still be an early time hearing about it. So I'm going to walk through the power of the profession initiative itself and the culminating unifying framework for the early childhood education profession. Then I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on the early childhood field and on the professional preparation field that supports early childhood educators, and on the opportunities and challenges that are ahead for us. And as we move forward with rebuilding, with building back better, with all of the pieces that we're gonna have to move forward with, I'm just gonna talk a little bit through sort of where we're thinking about our opportunities and look forward to a conversation with all of you as well. So I want to actually take us back first as we're going forward to think about the ways in which the conversation around the early childhood profession, the work to advance it, has been such a long time coming. And we really built the power of the profession on decades of advocacy and leadership by many of you and your colleagues in states and at the federal and national levels across the country. We really informed the work by past and current strategies. And so really looked at the conceptual framework for early childhood education that former NAEYC staff Barbara Willer and Sue Bredekamp wrote 30 years ago, thinking about the Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth Through Age 8 report, which the picture of the cover is on the screen. For those of you who have not read all like 800 pages of it, chapter 12, I think, has the recommendations. It is a body of research that so clearly makes the case for why the birth to 8 age range is so important from a brain science perspective, what we know about the science of early learning. It makes the case that there are skills and competencies and knowledge that cannot be ignored, and that we need to transform this workforce in alignment with that science. Supported by that research and polling from NAEYC, from many of our partners that states have done, national organizations like First 5 Years Fund and others who have looked very clearly at, we know, all polls will say essentially that the support for early childhood education is incredibly high across all political divides, geographic divides, racial divides. Support for early childhood education remains high. Some of our early research and polling found that that remains true even when we talk about specific investment, and even when we talk about specific investment in early childhood educators themselves. We found real desire to invest in the workforce, and that's something that has actually come a long way. We're not sure that was true even 10, 15 years ago. There was a lesser understanding about the link between, at least among the public, early childhood educators, we've always known, but among the public, a link between the profession and early childhood education. The strengthening of that link has been something that we've really looked forward to as we're able to move forward with all of this, with lessons drawn from other professions. So we looked internally to the early childhood education field, and we really looked out. We looked at nursing, at architecture, at speech and language pathology, at construction. How have other fields moved from, for example, for nursing, to not being a profession to being a profession. What was that process? How did they go through it? How did they structure their profession? And we learned a great deal from talking to members of those other professions about their process that we've used to apply to our own work as well. Ultimately, the research and the science are clear. There is a need for significant and sustained investments in high quality early childhood education provided by well-prepared and well-compensated professionals who reflect the diversity of the children and families they serve. There is no solution to the challenge of providing high quality early childhood education without public investment. It's not possible. We tried. We tried to base it on families and on educators who are subsidizing the system through their own low wages. There is no solution to this that does not involve a significant public investment that sees childcare as a public good. If we are going to get that significant, sustained public major investment, we're talking about a ton of money, then we need to be unified and clear around what the career pathways, the knowledge and competencies, the qualifications, the standards, the accountability, the supports, the compensation. We need to be clear about who we are and what we do when we're asking for that kind of public investment, which is what we're asking. We're asking for taxpayers to say, this is a public good that benefits all of us, and so we're going to support it. And we want to know what happens when we provide that kind of significant and sustained investment. What are we investing in? For whom? To do what? And those are the kinds of questions that we needed to be able to answer and that we couldn't. And so that's why we went through the Power to the Profession process. The Power to the Profession has had multiple, the initiative itself, the work of the last 3 years essentially, had multiple pieces in it. There was a Power to the Profession National Task Force, and these are the members of that task force. There were 15 members of the task force, most of whom were represented by the executive directors, presidents of those organizations. And they gathered at a table in NAEYC's basement, which is euphemistically known as the lower level, and fought it out essentially for over the course of 3 years to really go through what I'll walk through shortly in terms of the decision cycles around these fundamental questions about who we are. And you can see the task force was really represented by the members of the field itself. They had to have, part of this is about putting the educators at the center of the decisions, at the center of the recommendations and policy making. And so each of these organizations hold a piece of the field, from the labor unions and the teachers unions to the National Association for Family Childcare to Early Care and Education Consortium, which has a lot of the big early childhood and childcare groups, the National Head Start Association, the Association of Teacher Educators for both the associate's degrees and the bachelor's degree, Council for Professional Recognition, which holds CDA. So it was really everybody coming together to really talk about how to advance as a full profession. Importantly, though, it was not the 15 members of the 15 organizational leads in a room by themselves making the decisions without being guided by the input and feedback of the members of the field itself. And so we went through multiple iterative rounds of both English and Spanish language feedback with about 11,000 individuals all told. I'm going to walk through a little bit of the ways that we did this. There was broad-based engagement. So many of you probably participated in online surveys with events. Many of the states, many of our partners, Ohio, as well as many other states, held focus groups, held webinars, keynotes, presentations, information sessions that really allowed us to get access to a huge range of perspective, of expertise, of experience that folks really brought to the table. There's also some very explicit intentional engagement around educators from communities of color, educators whose first language is Spanish, educators from rural communities, and educators working in family childcare settings who are often underrepresented in efforts like this. And we wanted to make sure that their voices were equally as centered in making sure that as we're forming recommendations around how to move forward, those voices were at the center of that work. Through much of before I sort of get into some of the recommendations themselves, We really spent a lot of time thinking not just about the framework as a document itself, but about what it means for the implementation moving forward. And felt it was very important, the task force felt it was very important to make some very explicit promises to the field about the process for implementation. Because as you can imagine, in all of this feedback and in all of the loops for how we went through making decisions, the level of fear that people feel in the field about what this is going to do, about what process, based on what's happened already and what they've seen come out from other initiatives, there's a real level of fear about what this is going to mean for the field and what's going to happen. And we needed to make a pact with each other about what this looks like moving forward. So being very clear that we're not talking about advocating for increased educational requirements without also advocating for the funding to provide requisite supports and attendant compensation. And there's a reason that we're going to talk about compensation, which I could talk about all day, but over and over and over again. We've moved from being like the thing that people raise in the back of the room, like, hey, can we talk about compensation, to I think being something that gets talked about more as a recognition that we have to address it. If we do not address the compensation for the early childhood education profession, we will have the same conversation forever and ever. So there's a reason that we talk about it a lot now. We're not going to advocate for new regulations or requirements without advocating for increased funding and capacity supports. The programs and educators across all settings, that we're really talking about a multi-setting, we're setting agnostic essentially. High quality early childhood education can take place in any setting. The question is, do they have the supports and funding they need to deliver on it? We're not going to advocate for policies that advance the profession without doing the work to mitigate the unintended consequences. And that's a lot about this feedback and this engagement, making sure that we're talking to as many different people as possible to make sure that we're not missing consequences that we have not thought through. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but really thinking about realistic timelines, about educators from communities of color, about particular challenges that family childcare and community-based providers face, because we know about the widespread decline in family childcare in particular. I just want to highlight on the slide, there's a picture and a link, which when I send out the slides afterwards, which I'm happy to do, folks can link through to it. A paper on increasing qualifications centering equity that NAEYC did with partners at the Education Trust. And we did focus groups with educators from communities of color in 3 states who had been through an increasing qualifications process already and talked through their own recommendations for what other states and communities should do to frame out their policies and their practices and their supports in order so that as we are increasing these qualification requirements, we're putting equity at the center and making sure that everybody can meet those increased requirements and qualifications. Before I go on to the next sort of talking through the decision cycle process, let me just pause and see, Judith, if there's any questions that have come through that I
Lauren, we just had one about the slides, which you've answered. So
wonderful. Yes,
great
I'm happy to
keep going.
Slides. And there are links sort of embedded throughout, so folks can use those.
Wonderful.
Okay, any other questions that folks want to add in?
I think we're good at this time.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to walk through the decision cycle process itself. And essentially this was, you can see in the corner, this little circular icon, where we really began with research. We talked through the task force talked through its deliberations. It produced a draft that went out to the field. The field provided an extraordinary amount of thoughtful, engaged feedback that was often completely contradictory. And I say that in terms of, it was in a good way, like people felt extremely passionately on multiple sides of every issue, and would make very strong and compelling cases for why this recommendation was wrong, at the same time that a different person would comment on why it was wrong in the other direction. And the task force would take all of those and really delve into the comments, the feedback overarchingly, look at sort of the breakdown between like, okay, are there different outcomes and comments from family child care as opposed to pre-K? Are there different outcomes and comments, and how do we sort through that? They would take all of that and make the revisions for the task for the draft that would go back out to the field. We would repeat this cycle in some cases 3 times for decision cycles. So what started off as decision cycle 3, 4, 5 became a second draft of 3, 4, 5, became a third draft for 3, 4, 5, 6. There were lots of engagements and opportunities to comment from folks, and we're eternally grateful to the fields at large for taking the time to provide that kind of feedback. We know how important it was for folks to do so and how much we ask of people to engage in this process. The process itself was divided up into 8 different decision cycles, and some of these ended up getting combined, but essentially it was a way to think about how we prioritize and sequence our conversations around the early childhood education profession. There were many other ways, I'm sure, to do it this way. This was just the way we chose. So I'm going to walk through parts of each of these. I'm not going to walk through the comprehensive entire unifying framework because we'd be here for days, but we started really with the distinct name, the boundaries for the early childhood education profession. And I will just say that in many ways, this was the hardest one. It continues to be the one that we come back to almost always. It is emotional. It is fundamental to how we think and talk about early childhood educators, because it is a fundamental question of who we are and how we identify ourselves. And this is for a field that is deeply inclusive and values inclusivity as a core value to who we are. It is very hard for the field to say, this is an early childhood educator and this isn't. And so we come back to this all the time as we're thinking about what it means to define our competencies, our licensure, our professional preparation pathways. But we have to go through this process, because if we don't, we continue to muddy the waters on where we're driving investments and what it means to drive them. And I will say, in all of the advocacy that we've been doing around COVID and the challenges that the field is facing, the challenges we're facing at the congressional level and their fundamental inaction to save childcare at the moment, which we can come back to. The number of times that I have wished for an early childhood education profession so that we could direct investments more easily, so that we did not have to constantly try to talk to members of Congress, and for those who are doing state advocacy as well, state legislatures, about the many, many different ways that we have to think about investments. A profession that is clear and directed would bring us into an entirely new place for driving investments. When we talk about who early childhood educators are, we're talking about those who care for and promote the learning, development, and well-being of children birth through age 8. We're talking about those who meet the guidelines of the profession, are defined by their mastery of knowledge, skills, and competencies as defined by the profession. And that part is really important. We are those who define what we are responsible for too long. And there's a reason why I did not say K-12 when we talked about the professions we looked for. K-12 educators themselves are often not the ones who have the ability to define their own profession. It is so guided, just look at what's happening right now. It is so guided by policymakers who have too much say over what it is that educators must know and be able to do. We want to, that's not the way it works in other professions. It doesn't work that way for nurses. It doesn't work that way for doctors. It doesn't work that way for electricians or architects or speech language pathologists, but it does work that way for educators. And we are saying early childhood educators need to be out in front of this, or somebody else will be. They practice in all early childhood education settings, including family childcare. And I name that explicitly only because it comes up a lot in terms of what settings we mean. Family childcare continues to be part of the conversation and an important part of the conversation. You can see on the side, I know it's a little tough to see, but there is an early childhood field. Each of the members of the early childhood field are deeply valued. This is not a reflection on their importance importance or their worth or their value. It is saying that there is a profession within the early childhood field that has early childhood educators, higher ed faculty, pedagogical and instructional administrators, and all of these people sit within a broader early childhood field that includes folks like home visitors, mental health consultants, children's librarians, and folks who are providing care within the early childhood field, but are not members of the early childhood education profession. So there is a much larger field that remains important and where the early childhood education profession is embedded within that field. If the early childhood profession is defined in part by its knowledge and skills and competencies, this was a process that we went through as well. It was essentially decision cycle 2 at the moment, back when we were doing it. And the decision of the task force was to not start with a blank slate as we define the professional standards and competencies. In fact, we have no shortage of professional standards and competencies in early childhood education. We did a deep dive into all of them. And spent a lot of time sort of going through the professional standards and competencies before essentially launching a simultaneous process to develop the professional standards and competencies as the task force continued its work on the decision cycles. So the professional standards and competencies, when we did that in part because the CEOs and the presidents of the 15 organizations were not the right people to develop the professional standards and competencies. That needed to be done by a work group. Many of you, some of you I know who were involved in said work group, to develop the professional standards and competencies for the early childhood education profession. We used the NAEYC Standards for the initial and advanced early childhood preparation programs, known as professional prep standards. We used the Transforming the Workforce report, which identified some crucial gaps in the existing competencies, and we really interwove standards from other national organizations. I'm happy to go more into the development of the professional standards and competencies if folks are interested. There's an explanation for that within the unifying framework itself, sort of that process that we went through. It progressed simultaneously with the rest of the decision cycle work. Very importantly, one of the pieces that the professional standards and competencies did, and that the work group through extensive, difficult conversations identified, is the leveling of the standards to the designations of ECE 1, 2, and 3. So essentially, we looked at all of the professional standards and had very difficult conversations around what standards and competencies need to be mastered at the ECE 1 level, at the ECE 2 level, and at the ECE 3 level to really distinguish between CDA and the professional practice, the associate's degree in early childhood education, and the bachelor's degree in early childhood education. It required folks to come to the table and really get into the weeds on how to level these competencies in that way. The leveling, the first edition of leveling, we obviously expect it to evolve and change over time, but this was really the first time we got to that. The leveling is included in the professional standards and competencies that were released along with the unifying framework back in March, and I'll talk a little bit more about that release in a few minutes. I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned just a second ago, the ECE 1, 2, and 3 designations, and I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by those and what those are. Essentially, as we talk about a pathway for professional preparation, you know, that we have states where there's a 17 level career lattice. That is incredibly difficult for providers, for parents, for policymakers to understand and navigate. What we're looking to do here with the early childhood education profession is really reduce the cacophony of labels and roles down to 3 distinct and meaningful designations, but within one profession. And this is a little unique among professions that we looked at. Not many professions do it this way. We felt it was really important for early childhood education to have one profession with 3 designations within it. An ECE 1 that sort of aligns with the certificate and credential that's 120 hours that supports birth through age 8, an ECE 2, which is the associate's degree in early childhood education, and the ECE 3, which is the bachelor's degree or an initial prep master's degree for the early childhood education profession. Each preparation program, each of those programs, is responsible for preparing candidates who know, understand, and can implement the professional standards and competencies as they're leveled in alignment with those levelings. This was a really difficult, whenever I talk about these, I'm always like, this is the most difficult part. And I say that like 18 times. This was a really difficult part. There are folks who have made progression in many ways, but who have progressed because our field is so fractured. Folks have made progression while others have remained so severely behind. So because we support progression and not regression, we're saying that in state and district funded programs provided in mixed delivery settings, where they're explicitly aligned with the K-12 public school system, the ECE2 graduates, which are associate's degree graduates, can serve in a supportive educator role. So in public preschool and pre-K, essentially, ECE3 graduates need to serve in the lead educator role because they've made so much progress along that front already. And we don't want to provide an opportunity for regression. We want everybody to keep moving forward with the goal of having an ECE3 as part of the vision. And we want to support that progress for folks who most of the field has nothing, has no CDA, has no associate's degree. How do we make sure that we're moving everybody together in an equitable way? When we talk about the progression, we need to talk about the compensation. And this has been one of the most important pieces of the work. This is essentially, in many ways, a compensation initiative. This is about getting a compensated field. When we talk about compensation, we mean comparable compensation with benefits. We mean that the differences in settings and funding streams should not because they don't dictate differences in the nature of work being done, although that's sort of how we treat things. We're saying that educators with similar experience and qualifications need to be comparably compensated regardless of where they work. The setting is not the defining category, it should not define how people are paid, though it does now. We need to say that compensation increases with competency. At the moment, when somebody gets an increased degree, they go back to school, they get their bachelor's from their associate's degree, and they move from making $10.60 an hour to $10.90 an hour. It is impossible to sustain a system on that. It's impossible to create the incentives to move forward the way that they need to be. Compensation has to increase commensurate with increased preparation and increased competency. And it cannot be differentiated on the basis of the ages of children served. There is an extreme wage penalty that affects early childhood educators working with infants and toddlers. Those who are working with infants and toddlers are disproportionately educators from communities of color. And so that is essentially a wage penalty against educators from communities of color. All that we know about the brain science tells us about the importance of the earliest years, infants and toddlers, and thinking about them being the lowest paid of the lowest paid. We have to be inclusive to think about, that's why we talk about their need to be part of a birth through age 8 agenda that is held to the same expectations and accountability and provided with the same benefits as part of that. To that point, typically I think when we've set up these kinds of initiatives that advance the profession, the burden has fallen primarily on the profession itself. The educators sort of need to figure out, okay, we've raised standards, we've raised qualification requirements. Outside of Teach Early Childhood and other scholarship programs that have done an extraordinary job of saying, we're going to help you, there's been not an infrastructural resource structures and supports that take on all of the pieces to support early childhood educators. It's much more of a like, we're gonna set the bar, like best of luck in meeting it. That is not how this must be set up. We are saying that as a profession, early childhood educators welcome increased, clear, and consistent accountability. It's not accountability that educators are opposed to. It's how it's imposed upon them and who defines it. If accountability is aligned with our definitions of professional competencies and it results in increased compensation, accountability is welcomed. We want to be seen and supported as a profession. We understand that we can only expect the significant sustained increases in public finances that has to move the profession forward if we're going to be accountable for their use. But we can only be held accountable if we have the necessary and sufficient supports, resources, and infrastructure that allows that. So each section, each sort of bucket within the early childhood profession has a role to play in those expectations and in receiving those supports. I'm not going to talk through all 6 of these. I just want to recognize that there are roles to play for everybody, and I'm going to focus in on the professional preparation bucket and on the federal government bucket. So I'm just going to talk about 2 of them in terms of their expectations and supports. Early childhood educators, essentially, within this conception of the profession, have a license to practice, and that is funded and supported by professional preparation programs, employers, the professional governance structure, states, and the federal government in order to obtain the license. This is new for early childhood educators. Though many folks on and off this webinar have K-12 licensure pathways, the licensure for early childhood educators needs to be accessible, affordable, efficient, and high quality. Professional preparation programs have an extremely important role in that, obviously. Here's the vision for the professional preparation programs within the conception of the unifying framework. The idea, of course, is that there is wide and unbiased access to professional preparation pathways that allow both prospective and current early childhood educators to efficiently complete their preparation credentials. At the end of their professional preparation credentials at ECE 1, 2, or 3 levels, completers of programs will be confident that they have been prepared in the professional standards and competencies and that they're ready to meet their expected scopes of practice. In order to do that, professional preparation programs have responsibilities. They need to attain accreditation or recognition from an early childhood accreditation or recognition body. This is about providing the supports for early childhood educators to be part of a quality program. It's part of a quality improvement process that we commit to. They have to provide programs of study that are aligned to professional standards and competencies and ensure that, again, to the vision, that program completers are prepared to meet the requirements to be licensed to practice. There are expectations for accountability, and they're tied to as public funding is increased. Again, in no way is anybody saying, here are the expectations, go forth, figure it out, and meet them. As public funding is increased, the programs preparing members of the professional preparation for early childhood profession have to meet expectations, earning accreditation, demonstrating proficiency, and I saw the 3 buckets earlier, and articulation being one of them. One of the reasons that anybody went through the leveling process is to advance the seamless articulation strategies that streamline the pathways, to reduce duplication of coursework. What is it that higher ed is supposed to prepare people to know and be able to do at each level so that they can go through this process seamlessly, supporting multiple entry points into the profession so that individuals can advance their preparation and their role in the profession. Simultaneously to the expectations and accountability, there are supports for faculty and PD specialists. We outline some of those in conjunction with the higher ed groups and the professional preparation groups at all levels. So making sure the programs have at least one full-time faculty or PD specialist who oversees the program. That all faculty and professional development specialists have qualifications aligned to the expectations, that they're adequately compensated for the work we do, and we've seen the huge impact of COVID on obviously the childcare and early childhood field, but on higher ed as well, on adjunct faculty, whose compensation is also extraordinarily problematic. Have access to relevant and ongoing professional development at this level as well. That we think about ratios that are comparable to other clinically based programs within institutions, and that faculty and professional development specialists reflect the diversity of early childhood education students and US demographics. That's the supports for the faculty. There are also institutional supports that are enormously important. Everybody operates within an institution. In this case, if we're talking about associates and bachelor's degree faculty in particular, adequate data systems and technology that allow faculty and PD specialists to monitor progress, analyze and report on performance data and metrics. We know that folks are held accountable for reporting without the kind of data structures and supports that allow you to do that. Partnerships with high quality field experience sites. We're going to talk about this relative to the impact of COVID because field experiences have obviously been extraordinarily impacted. And we're endlessly impressed by the innovations and supports, the way that higher ed faculty are adapting in programs, but the field experiences are obviously a huge challenge for folks right now. The other thing is exposing students to a range of high quality settings, really thinking about how we embrace center-based, school-based, Head Start, early Head Start, family childcare. How do we support people in completing their field experiences and their clinical practice where they are, especially for practicing early childhood educators, and really having a multitude of experiences that allows them to be prepared birth through age 8. Dedicated resources and time for faculty and specialists to support and maintain accreditation and other quality improvement efforts. We know how much time it takes to provide quality improvement and to make sure that folks have the time and the resources to do that. Finally, there's a segment around support for students. So faculty, institutional support, student support, where we're having resources to provide the targeted supports for students that we need. And this includes everything from cohort models, formal mentoring and advising programs, and really paying particular attention to English language learners, developmental educational students, and first-gen students. Thinking about resources to recruit diverse groups of students. While typically in a recession, we often see increases in higher ed enrollment. I would say the data coming out so far in higher ed is mixed. We've seen some states that are experiencing increases in enrollment and other states that are where enrollment is way down. And the impact that's going to have on programs, when we have time to talk more, I'd love to hear more about how people are experiencing enrollment challenges and opportunities right now, as we're sort of getting deeper into the fall. Resources for innovative and flexible models for delivering course content. I will say that was written prior to COVID. And we've seen programs do extraordinary adaptations in providing flexible models for delivering course content and pivoting in ways that I'm not sure anybody thought was possible in the timeline that people accomplished it, and ensuring students are prepared to successfully demonstrate those competencies. I also just want to add, we really think about, and there's additional work that's being done around making sure that higher ed leadership sees and values their early childhood education programs. I know that's not always the case, and certainly not at the highest of levels, chancellors, presidents, provosts, boards of trustees. The support that we need to develop and work with that level of higher ed leadership to ensure that the programs at the ECE level are getting the kind of respect, investment, and engagement that they need, and the opportunities that COVID provides for that, and the challenges that it provides for that as well. I'm going to transition just to talking about the federal government as the financing backbone. I am certainly in a moment of extreme frustration and anger. We can go ahead and call it rage with the federal government and the lack of congressional action on the investment in childcare. Childcare is breaking, and Congress could act to save childcare, and they have not yet. That said, the federal government must serve as the financing backbone. There is no possibility for this without the investment of federal government as the financing backbone, both for reasons of equity and for reasons of scope and scale. Feds need to see early childhood education as the public good, to protect and invest in it as a public good, as we do infrastructure, as we do roads and K-12. And K-12 is different because of its funding streams are primarily local and state. Early childhood education is mostly, as folks know, funded by the federal government, and it needs to continue to increase its investment at that level. That is not to let states off the hook. States also need to increase their investments in early childhood education. Local communities have been stepping up. I know there are many local communities in Ohio, from Toledo to Columbus to Cleveland, who have done enormous work to step up locally for early childhood education. But the federal government, from an equity perspective, really needs to serve as the financing backbone. They need to provide the necessary financing to address the true cost of quality, which includes adequate compensation for the profession. Compensation is part of quality. It is part of quality. It cannot be done later or after or at a separate time. It has to be integrated into the cost of providing childcare itself. We have to advance higher education quality and access, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about the opportunities of the federal government to advance higher ed quality and access, to support comprehensive scholarships, to support loan forgiveness for early childhood educators, and to really think about these definitions that advance the understanding of the early childhood education profession as those who have birth through age 8, who hold specialized skills and knowledge, who have competencies to work with all children across all settings. This is really the foundation that we all built together over what took essentially, 3 years and also 30 years and also 90 years. It was a long time building a foundation, and it will be to come. The implementation of the unifying framework is going to be very difficult, and every victory is going to be hard won. In March, on March 9th, which was in fact the week that on March 9th, we launched the unifying framework for the early childhood education profession. We had all 15 of the national organizations literally standing together. And it was, for many of us, the last time we were all in a room. I think it was the last time I hugged anybody who I'm not related to. And we were still there was a lot of elbow bumping, and people were sure yet what was happening. It was about 3 days before our country went into lockdown. And that gives us a moment to have this work be done, the roadmap to have been created. This is the unifying framework for the early childhood education profession. These are the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators that together form this incredible foundation and roadmap for moving forward. We've also seen, we are building on, even prior to COVID, a multi-year bipartisan supported increases in federal funding for early childhood education. We have seen support that is Republican and Democrat for increases in funding to childcare. We've seen media attention like we have never seen to the childcare crisis that has really been paid. Is still not fully broken through. Though my Twitter feed and my media alerts are filled with it, I know that it has not fully broken through to the level of priority that it needs to. At the same time, we have seen tremendous increases in media attention to the childcare crisis and to what that looks like. And yet, what is COVID-19 doing to that foundation? So I'm gonna start with some of the challenges. There is the potential for permanent, widespread childcare closures. I think when I first wrote this slide, there was still potential for permanent, widespread childcare closures. We are now seeing much more than the potential for that. We are seeing permanent, widespread childcare closures, and we will see more. An exacerbated lack of supply, which, to the next point, really could and will and has in some states already resulted in increased calls for a looser regulatory environment and essentially lowered standards as they try to solve an exacerbated lack of supply with a anything goes, anyone can do this, let's just lower the bar and flood the market approach. We are going to see decimated state budgets for years to come. It's going to take a long time to rebuild from this. And a widening of the gap between the birth to 5 and the K-3 spaces, where we have seen, while we know the science has a developmental stage from birth to age 8, the way that educators in the K-12 system and the way that educators in the childcare system have been treated in the course of this pandemic has been devastating and has really demonstrated a deep divide in how we see and treat educators in different age groups and different settings. It's also been an extraordinary impact on higher education. The first link in the slide is to a brief from NAEYC from on-campus to online, the impact of the pandemic on higher ed programs. Just a couple of highlights. As folks know, almost every institution shifted classes online back to the spring. There's a tremendous economic impact on faculty and students and on faculty and student emotional health, on their access to, their familiarity with and access to technology and Wi-Fi. we are dealing with limited to no access to field experiences and observations. It's a central component of programs that isn't available by and large to folks right now, at least on an in-person basis. It's impacting students' ability to complete programs. It's impacting programs' ability to administer assessments. And I will say, as we're looking at the challenges that folks are facing and what we've been reading, and I'm sure what you're hearing about on a daily basis, the margin is narrow for students living on the margins, and students who are grappling with poverty, with hunger, with other siblings at home, with families who are losing jobs, with limited access to Wi-Fi, with incredible financial hurdship. Their ability to stay in school, to come to their classwork and complete it, this is a crisis. It is a crisis, and there's deep uncertainty about the future with potential college closures, depending on the financial impact. With falling enrollment, there's tremendous impact on higher education from the pandemic. Just real briefly to what Congress was able to pass in the CARES Act back in the spring, there was a higher education emergency relief fund with about $14 billion to higher education. Payments of principal and interest for direct student loans has been suspended and extended. There's flexibility in some of these federal education grants and the distribution to support what's needed at the institutional level, and provisions sort of being made for students who have withdrawn from school or relocated during the COVID-19 crisis. But like the child care investments that came through the CARES Act, this funding is running out. And we are needing an additional attention and investment from both the federal and state levels to the crisis that's happening in childcare and higher education. At the same time, there are opportunities that are being created by COVID-19. And those include innovative responses from faculty. We have seen, again, extraordinary work from faculty and programs to adapt to their circumstances, to support students, to make sure that they're able to stay in programs and complete them. We are seeing trillions of dollars in relief and recovery, although the prospect for the relief that's needed is grim for moving forward in the next month. We're continuing the fight, and I'm happy to talk about what you all can do to help us in joining that fight to put pressure on Congress to act. There's opportunities around the recognition of the underlying vulnerabilities in early childhood. Whenever we talk about the childcare crisis now, and this goes to the media coverage point, we talk about the way that this is just revealing the cracks that were already there. And that has given, I think, a renewed understanding of the depths of the challenges in childcare, a search for new ways of doing business. This gets to the innovative responses from faculty and to early childhood educators, program directors themselves. A renewed understanding of childcare as essential. We know that word is being thrown around a lot and is not accompanied by the investments that treat childcare and those who provide it as essential. They're treated as expendable, even while they're said that childcare is essential, but there is this recognition of the essential nature of childcare and an opportunity to hold policymakers accountable for treating childcare and early childhood educators that way. We have seen some increased temporary compensation for educators and ways that states adapted, for example, in policies that paid based on enrollment and not by attendance. Good policy changes that give us an opportunity to build on those moving forward. Increased appreciation for the value of family childcare settings, and increased appreciation for educators, especially among parents. I know in the early days of the pandemic and now when we're now doing remote learning, we see parents sort of speaking out on social media around, teachers should be paid $1 million a day. And I don't know how anybody does this. I have such enormous respect for my teachers. We've also seen, obviously, a lot of blame game between educators of different ages and teachers and parents. And we've tried to mitigate some of that as much as possible by, you know, for example, last week there was a solidarity statement with 125 groups, state and national, representing about 10 million educators, parents, who sort of said, you know, we're not pointing the finger at each other, we're pointing it at Congress and their failure to act. Holding on to having that solidarity and folks looking together at a new vision, there is, we've said this time and again now, we're not going back. There's no point in going back to the status quo before it already wasn't working. We have to look ahead. We cannot go from the crisis we have now back to the crisis that was already defining childcare and early learning in our professional preparation systems. We have to look ahead. We have to redirect the funding and focus. I just want to say this was always actually part of a Power to the Profession vision. It was never intended for the recommendations in the unifying framework to be layered on top of existing systems. We have built this system based on a fundamental lack of trust in early childhood educators themselves. We have to unwind some of the systems we have to free up the funding and focus that can be directed towards the factor that makes the biggest difference in driving access and quality, which is the workforce. It is the workforce that is that must be at the center of all of this. And we can peel away some of the regulations, some of the system that is about a fundamental mistrust in early childhood educators to be the professionals to do their jobs. We can realign that and reinvest that in the workforce themselves and peel away some of that additional work. We have impetus to do this now because because of all these challenges we've identified around a lack of supply, a lack of qualified early childhood educators, a lack of funding, a need for a simplicity and a consistency within the field, and an opportunity to really rethink what this field looks like. We want to think about the policies and pathways for moving forward. We think about things like shifts. You know, I mentioned the shift from things like paying on attendance to paying on enrollment. Those are really wonky shifts in childcare that make a huge difference to the infrastructure and sustainability of the programs, so that folks at the higher ed level have strong childcare, early childhood education programs with which to do their field experiences, where they can go practice within quality settings. Thinking about these shifts in things like the Child Care and Development Block Grant to contracts, so that we can think about consistency and quality, where we think about QRIS shifts from investments from the R, where we just rate all day, to the I, where we really think about the improvement. Public pre-K shifts to increase mixed delivery so that we're supporting family childcare and community-based programs. We talk about increased access to apprenticeships. There's a lot of bipartisan interest in apprenticeships and thinking about what it looks like to use, I mean, it's essentially a word of the day, but apprenticeships, which are essentially acquiring skills and competencies and degrees as people work, is basically how early childhood works. Early childhood educators mostly earn degrees while they're working as early childhood educators. And thinking about those funding streams that are available to us to support programs that are providing degrees and credentials as early childhood educators are going through them. Think about increasing educators' access to healthcare and retirement benefits, to paid leave benefits. I mean, when we think about the spread of COVID, in some cases that could have been mitigated if early childhood educators had access to paid leave and to healthcare, we can see all the connective tissue here. Scholarships and grants and forgivable loans for certificates and credentials. We've talked about, I mean, we got to think big about things like a GI Bill, but for essential workers, which includes childcare providers. We've thought in the past about how we support and incentivize and reward those who are putting their lives and livelihoods on the line for this country. Early childhood educators are doing that every day right now. How do we support them in moving forward in that way? And we have to talk about raising revenue. And what it looks like to really raise revenue at local, state, and federal levels to ensure that we have the funding we need to make the changes that we need to make. There are meaningful federal opportunities. We spent a lot of the last year prior to COVID thinking about a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. That is not going to happen in this Congress, but the Higher Education Act needs to be reauthorized, and it will happen one day. And there are lots of opportunities as we reauthorize it to think about the connections between early childhood education and higher education. It's not a connection that our policymakers make enough. That if they care about childcare, which many of them do and say they do, then they also have to think about their work to support higher education and the educators who provide childcare. Has been movement because the Higher Ed Act needs to be reauthorized. There's been movement on bills like the College Affordability Act, which was introduced in the House of Representatives, around extraordinary investment in educators from birth through college, and really thinking about how we invest in educators through certificates, degrees at all levels, and their scholarships, in loan forgiveness and accountability, and thinking about the expansion of Pell and what it looks like to support early childhood educators and taking advantage of that. We really think about career technical education and apprenticeships. Again, we mentioned apprenticeships a minute ago, but really thinking about the opportunities to align and to provide a pathway from career technical education all the way through the apprenticeships, and making sure that your state has conceptualized early childhood education as part of their, for example, their Perkins plans, to make sure that they're thinking about the career technical education, the opportunities for early ed. Have been, in just this last year when we looked, there were more than 50 bills that were introduced related to improving higher education access and quality, to thinking about loans and accountability and accreditation. There are examples from both sides of the aisle, and I've identified some of those here to just show the depth and breadth of interest in the federal opportunities to invest in higher education in ways that benefit early childhood educators, both current and prospective. There are acts that would increase compensation as they earn their degrees, as they're going through that process. They're preserving teacher loan forgiveness for military spouses, where we're looking at reciprocity, where we're looking at rural educator support and training, and ensuring that as we think about rural broadband access, which is not necessarily something that we as early childhood educators think about as legislation that we need to support, but without which neither at this point early childhood educators who are trying to go through their higher education processes, nor in some cases early childhood educators who are trying to provide support for their children and families, we need increased rural access to broadband. Preparing and retaining education professionals, considering Teachers Act, making sure that we have conceptions for early childhood educators and allowances for the way that they work across settings in all of these opportunities is one of the pieces that we've been thinking a lot about. We really need to build, in order to pass some of this at both the federal and state level, we have to build the political will for this. There's an increased awareness of the low compensation for those working in childcare. That has been, I suppose, a silver lining, but really messed up silver lining, but a messed up silver lining in the pandemic, that we've been able to highlight the low compensation. There are too many people who still don't know how little early childhood educators make and how difficult it is to recruit people into this profession when they know that at the end of it, they're not going to make any money. There's an increased awareness of the need for folks in childcare, a sense about the We Are Essential, a public image campaign that really builds on this sense of essential nature and holds policymakers and parents accountable for saying things like early childhood educators should earn $1 million a day. It's like, well, we don't need to earn $1 million a day, but we do need to earn more than $10.60 an hour. So let's talk about the essential nature that needs to move forward to help people connect this childcare and early childhood education connection. This is been a pendulum that has swung back and forth for decades. But we are in a moment where childcare is primarily held up as a workforce support, and ensuring that as we have these conversations and this policy movement, we continue to think about the importance of quality investments. Even as we think about childcare as a workforce support, it is both. K-12 is also a childcare system, whether or not they like to think about it like that. We can do both. We can do both education and childcare. It can be both a workforce support, but it can't be a workforce support at the expense of also making sure that we think about the investments in quality. Having parents and educators stay together to thank and support and build political champions. And I am going to end this and as we come to the end to talk about the fact that we're in an election season, because I can't not. And we're also going to talk about traditional and social media as a way to build political will. Before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about taking action. And I can pause in case there are any questions before I go into sort of the steps that states and higher education institutions are taking, even now, as we start to implement the recommendations from the unifying framework. Are there any questions?
Lauren, we do have a question.
Great.
Can you clarify that this is for all sectors of ECE? We have heard that there is some concern that the increased focus on advocacy and funding on childcare may put Head Start funding at risk.
That's a great question. So first, I can definitely assure you that it is all sectors. Head Start has been an incredibly important partner in all of this, and in thinking about standards and comprehensive supports and how we think about the support for children and families with low incomes in particular. When we've been doing the advocacy for childcare and Head Start, it's been very we recognize the need to support each other in all of this, and Head Start's explicit ask for $1.7 billion at the federal level to make sure that they are able to continue to meet the needs. It's been fascinating to watch sort of the way that it's played out differently in the way that folks are funded. The financing differences in Head Start and childcare have really illuminated the challenges for childcare in particular. And Head Start has been phenomenal in making sure that they're able to support childcare right now, to be able to say, you know, when we talk about contracts and when we talk about stability, the way that Head Start is financed has allowed for way more stability than childcare has been able to experience. Being able to say, to point to one, to be able to say, look, we can do this in a way that allows for the sustainability and stability across all settings. It's been a real moment for everybody to really be able to say, we're able to support each other in this, and to make sure that we're able to talk about this across states and settings. So again, there's been a lot of cross-sector support. And we saw that even in, you know, the K-12 setting as well, where we've had folks, you know, you've seen, I'm sure folks have seen the challenges where K-12 teachers have not been as supportive of childcare and sort of said, you know, we're not childcare, we don't do babysitting. And we've also seen educators then step up, and many folks, unions and other K-12 folks, sign the solidarity letter in saying, you know, we all need support from birth to 12, educators of all ages. You cannot play us off each other like this. We need support in childcare, in Head Start, in special education, in K-12, in higher ed. All of these pieces of the puzzle need support. Does that help?
I think so.
Okay. Feel free to keep it to ask more. So let me talk a little bit about sort of the states and higher education, and the way that people are sort of taking action already. So there's opportunities to adopt and adapt the ECE professional standards and competencies, and to incorporate them into the required approval process for institutions of higher ed, to make sure that there really is alignment in making sure that the professional standards and competencies are embedded in the institutions for higher education, to align to the ECE 1, 2, and 3 designations in areas including professional prep, career lattices, pathways, QRIS. This is again where we've seen folks move from, or start to move from, their 17-layer or 9-layer, whatever, career lattice into these ECE 1, 2, and 3 designations, aligning preparation programs to the competencies and the leveling, ensuring faculty are qualified to teach candidates in the competencies, ensure the competencies and the leveling are facilitating the transfer and articulation, and ensuring the quality, increasing the coherence, and frankly, reducing the bureaucracy via accreditation. Just a couple of examples of folks that people are already doing this: Oregon, Pennsylvania, Washington, Wyoming. There are many different ways. These are just a few that we pulled out of ways that there's alignment on the professional advancement and higher education examples in some of the states where folks are aligning registry systems or registered apprenticeship programs, or using the professional standards and competencies for the P3 endorsement in teacher certification. Providing PD pathways in multiple languages. Again, we know lots of folks are doing this. This is just one example. Aligned and redesigning professional learning for early childhood education workforce and aligning the system to the professional standards and competencies. And again, there's a real mix, like that's happening in Wyoming. It's not necessarily all of the states that are furthest along in terms of their professional preparation systems already. As promised, I am going to end by talking about the fact that it is an election year, and there is an extraordinary amount at stake. There are 35 seats in the Senate, there are 11 gubernatorial elections, there are hundreds of local elections, 435 House of Representatives seats, and 40 million children who are going to be impacted by what happens now. We have, since 2016, NAEYC has established some work in the electoral space. And we have a nonpartisan Our Votes, Their Futures campaign to elevate early childhood as an election issue at all levels and on all sides, with a focus on increasing voter participation. Everybody on this call and everybody you talk to has the ability to focus on early childhood educators, on students that are in your programs, on parents of young children, to really increase our engagement in electoral advocacy efforts and make sure people are thinking about early childhood education in those efforts, having systems in place to support voting among staff and faculty and students and parents. Are you talking to your colleagues, to your students about being registered to vote and being engaged in the voting process so that you can talk to your candidates about the importance of investing in early childhood education? This is something that everybody should be held accountable for at all levels. We have an opportunity, America for Early Ed. You can go to americaforearlyed.org/pledge. For folks who are pledging to vote, there's really great research around the fact that if somebody pledges to vote, they are more likely to do so. And so we really encourage people to take the pledge to vote, to ask others to pledge to vote, and to register to vote as well. So this week, it's now, it's Thursday? No, nobody ever knows the day. It's Thursday. On Tuesday, it was National Voter Registration Day, but you can still register to vote and make sure that you can check your voter registration. Encourage other people to register to vote. Support your colleagues, your students, your staff, and making sure they're registered to vote as well. As an early childhood educator and as an advocate for early childhood education who is committed to talking to candidates about the importance of these issues. When you go to America for Early Ed, you can get access to town hall signs, virtual as well as in person, where you can hold up signs about the importance of investing in early childhood education and in early childhood educators. And they give you little questions and data on the back. So there's lots of ways and support to get the engagement in the electoral advocacy process that is just so crucially important to our ability to move forward. In addition, I just wanted to include some links for folks. Again, they can access these through the slides, but some resources for higher ed, for ECE higher ed programs, from our NAEYC's own COVID resources to the Access listserv and think tank, to resources from Script North Carolina, the A summary of higher ed provisions in the CARES Act. There are lots of opportunities to make sure that you have the resources you need to support your work. That's all I have. So I'm going to pause and see if we can have a conversation. This last link that I would say is just, these are Watch and Talk virtual gatherings to advance the unifying framework. You can go to powertotheprofession.org and get the unifying framework itself, as well as some of these guidelines to help you, whether you're faculty or supporting early childhood education directors, to have these conversations about the unifying framework with prospective and current, with students, prospective early childhood educators and current early childhood educators about the framework. Folks can watch the 45-minute launch itself. And then there's guidelines and guiding questions, these virtual gatherings, to sort of help folks talk through the unifying framework and what it means for them and their engagement and their profession that they are going to own and be the ones to move forward. So I encourage folks to access those. They're available at powertotheprofession.org. And I will stop there.
Okay, Lauren, we do have, we know that it's wages are kind of built in different states and on many different criteria that gets assessed on. But we do have a question. In your opinion, what do you feel would be an appropriate wage for early childhood educators in a preschool setting? So are there any thoughts? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would say, again, it's true. It does vary tremendously by state. And states have started, there are a couple of states that I encourage folks to look to in terms of sort of salary scales and wage scales. Rhode Island has really done an extraordinary job in crafting some of their wage scales and how they're thinking about it. North Carolina as well. And I'm happy to send those to you, Judith, when I do the, when I send you the slides so that folks can access those and link to them.
Sure.
It really is a question of comparability and sort of thinking about how that is set out for your state and your locality as well. I think we can all agree. You know, when we talked about the comparability issue as well, it's interesting because it's not like K-12 salaries aren't too low too, right? Like there's an acknowledgement that K-12 is too low as well. And saying that that's sufficient is not realistic. It does need to be higher. It is saying that that is a minimum essentially of where early childhood educators should be, that there is on principle a need to have there be comparability for educators working with children birth through age 8 and above. And also that there is a need to look to other professions who work with young children to really look at the range of supports that we give. And that is a much broader and longer fight.
Absolutely. We did have a comment, build back better. Thanks for the inspiration this morning, Lauren.
You guys, I will say, are the most inspiring. We hear from faculty and educators every day, often with incredibly devastating stories of what they're facing. And you all are the reason that we're fighting as hard as we can. So thank you guys so much for the extraordinary work that you're doing in the face of incredible hardship.
Yes, so go ahead and type any questions that you have in the question and answer box for Lauren.
If I stop sharing, I can stop sharing. That way I can see any questions that are coming in. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Hi, friends.
Okay, well, Lauren, we so appreciate your participation this morning. It was a lot of great information. We appreciate that even through a pandemic that there's still movement with this profession piece. So we just want to say thank you on behalf of all of our Ohio participants.
It's my pleasure. And we are absolutely looking forward to continue partnership with everybody who's interested with moving forward with all the advocacy work that's going to need to be done and all of the reframing and rebuilding that's going to need to be done at the higher education levels and with the legislature. And you talked about moving forward a little bit. I can say, you know, that we are working on standing up the professional governance board and writing model legislation and regulatory language that folks can use to be able to move this forward. So if folks have additional questions about that and opportunities to engage in that, we'll definitely be coming back to folks for continued guidance and feedback and input on the best ways to move forward in Ohio and throughout the country.
Wonderful. Well, definitely have a great rest of your day, Lauren.
Thank you all. And thank you all so much. I hope you all have a great rest of your days as well. Stay safe.